You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, it looks like a top Trump advisor is now headed off to prison. Can you speak on what happened with Peter Navarro and his contempt conviction?
Yeah, Navarro will be reporting to the Federal Bureau of Prisons soon to begin serving a 4-month sentence. And I don't mind saying I hope he is the first of many Trump advisors and associates and officials who assisted Donald Trump in trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. So here is what Navarro did, and here is what landed him or will soon land him in prison. He tried to help Donald Trump overturn the election results, and his piece of it was to try to pressure Mike Pence to not count the Electoral College votes in a timely manner, delay it while they tried to find other ways to overturn the results of the election. And I'm going to call it funny. Yes, it's sad and horrific, but it's also pretty damn funny. Peter Navarro gave his coup plan a cute name. He called it the Green Bay Sweep, which was a famous play that was deployed by Green Bay Packers coach Vince Lombardi. And it was a devastating play that the defense could often not stop it. So Peter Navarro thought, well, you know what? If I give my coup plot a cute name, like the Green Bay Sweep, people will be none the wiser. Well, Peter Navarro is being Green Bay swept right into a prison cell for what he did, because when his criminal plot failed, ultimately he was subpoenaed by the House Select Committee investigating the insurrection. He was given two subpoenas, one for testimony and one for documents. His testimony and the documents would have provided incriminating evidence against Donald Trump. So what did Navarro do? He blew them off. He defied lawfully issued congressional subpoenas, and he was referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution. DOJ indicted him on 2 counts of contempt of Congress for blowing off the subpoenas, and Peter Navarro thought he could beat it, so he went to trial. And guess what? He couldn't beat it. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison, and as a last-ditch attempt to stay out of prison, his attorney filed a motion at the time of his sentencing or shortly thereafter saying, wait, can defendant Navarro stay on release pending appeal? Can he stay out while his appeal works its way through the system, which can take quite a bit of time? And the presiding judge, Judge Amit Mehta, considered it and rejected it. So now Navarro has one last-ditch attempt. He could try to run to the appellate court and ask them to hold off his sentence, but I would bet the full buck on the appellate court not weighing in. The trial court judge said, no, you will report to prison. And I don't think the appellate court will touch that.
Well, Navarro is going to be done with his entire sentence by the time his appeal actually gets heard. So at that point, is he going to even bother appealing?
Yeah, he undoubtedly will. And there are two things in play. One, even if you have served your entire sentence, by the time the appellate court finally gets around to hearing your appeal, you don't want to be a convict. You don't want a criminal conviction on your record for the rest of your life. So
Although that is like a prerequisite in Republican politics today.
well, it is a perk on a resume, I would agree. And it probably qualifies you to be part of Trump's next cabinet in the horrific event he's reelected, which I don't think he
Yeah.
will be. But the other thing he can do is try to file a motion for an expedited appeal saying, I'm sitting in prison. Can you please hear my appeal on an expedited basis? I predict that will go nowhere as well. But look, he'll still have the opportunity to challenge his conviction. And if the appellate court throws it out, he will no longer be a convict.
Glenn, could Donald Trump's case follow the same path where if he's convicted and then sentenced to prison, even if he does appeal, he would still have to report to prison in the meantime?
Absolutely. And depending on which case goes to trial first, because there are different judges presiding over different cases, here's how I see it playing out. Let's assume that the federal prosecution for trying to overturn the election being presided over by Judge Tanya Chutkan is the first one to go to trial. And I think it is likely to be the first federal case to go to trial, and he's convicted, which he will be based on the overwhelming evidence, in my opinion and experience. He will be sentenced to prison by Judge Chutkan, and I don't think there's a chance she grants a motion that he should be allowed to stay on release. Just go home, go back to Mar-a-Lago, go up to Bedminster, be comfortable, even though you've been convicted for trying to, in substance, bring an end to our democracy. I don't think there's a chance Judge Chutkan leaves him on release. I think she orders him into prison. And just like Navarro is doing, I think he'll run to the appellate court and try to get a stop put to that, and they won't. So I think if I had to bet my buck, my betting limit, I'm not a gambling man, I would probably put the full buck on Donald Trump being sentenced to prison and probably reporting to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in advance of the 2024 presidential election.
Okay. Glenn, at the same time that Peter Navarro, who we were just speaking about, is likely headed to prison now, Steve Bannon was in the exact same position as Navarro, like an identical case as his, but he won't serve a single day. Can you speak on that?
I can. Have you ever heard the saying, what a difference a day makes? I'm going to modify it a little bit. What a difference a judge makes. Steve Bannon committed exactly the same crimes as Peter Navarro. He was involved in the attempt to overturn the election. He was subpoenaed by Congress lawfully. He blew off the subpoenas for evidence and documents because similarly, he wanted to hide incriminating information about Donald Trump. He was indicted. He went to trial. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to 4 months. He made the same ask that Navarro made. Judge, please don't make me report to prison. Leave me on release. Let me go home. Let me keep doing my podcast and riling up Trump's base and undermining confidence in the American election systems and processes while I appeal my case. And the judge granted that motion. Why the different treatments in the two different cases? Well, Judge Amit Mehta, former public defender, straight up judge, calls it down the middle, fair, impartial, independent, ordered Navarro into prison. The judge presiding over Steve Bannon's case is a Trump appointee named Carl Nichols, and he did this enormous favor for Steve Bannon, and that is a real black eye on the federal judiciary in Washington, D.C.
I'm going to ask like a pointless question here, but how can it be that for identical crimes, just the difference of two judges, like there's so little of a standard or guidelines for these judges to follow that just based on their own political leanings, you can have one person end up in prison and another person walking totally free, everything else completely the same?
Brian, that's ultimately what it boils down to. Now, if you want me to try to, grasp at straws and try to distinguish the two cases, the only thing I could say is that, Bannon held one position in the Trump administration and Navarro held another. I don't know that he held an official position. He was some kind of an economic advisor to Donald Trump. And the two cases were slightly different in that maybe Steve Bannon had a minimally greater claim to possible executive privilege. He ultimately had no claim. But
Right.
as I'm trying to
Right.
explain this to you, I'm not believing myself.
Right.
This is
Yeah.
a
I mean,
miscarriage
I mean,
of justice.
the obvious fact is just that Carl Nichols is a right-wing hack, and so he was giving throwing a bone to Steve Bannon. And it's as simple as that. Sometimes we don't have to look any deeper than exactly what it is.
Yeah, Occam's razor, right? The simplest, most straightforward explanation is probably the right one.
Let's finish off with this. To that exact point, Meadows and Scavino also ignored congressional subpoenas. Why did they get to evade accountability altogether? Like, forget about even having to draw a lucky judge. They didn't even get that far.
Yeah, I don't have a good explanation. I think it was a miscarriage of justice that those two high government officials who had a duty to comply with lawfully issued congressional subpoenas blew them off. That's an outrage, and it's just a debasement of the executive branch and what it should stand for. Here is what I think happened. When those two men were referred for prosecution by Congress to the Department of Justice, because they were both actual sort of active Trump administration officials at the highest levels, particularly Meadows, I think maybe the Department of Justice flinched and said, well, they're actually going to have some viable claims of executive privilege, such that maybe that's not an entirely winning argument for us. Of course, you can't win the case you don't bring. And there's no shame or embarrassment in losing a difficult case. But Brian, there's nothing but shame and embarrassment for deciding not to bring a difficult case for fear of losing. Those two men should have been prosecuted. They weren't. And I think that was the wrong call by the Department of Justice.
Although I would add a silver lining, and given how cautious the Department of Justice is in bringing cases that they don't think they can win, the fact that they have brought cases against Donald Trump in two different jurisdictions, both in Washington, D.C. and the classified documents case in Florida, both kind of lend itself to this idea then that they're extremely confident in the outcome of this case. The fact that they would bring it when to your point with Meadows and Scavino, if they had even a modicum of doubt that they're not even going to bring these cases, which by the way they probably should have brought, the fact that they would then bring it against Trump really does show their confidence in his prosecution.
That's an excellent point, but let me put a little bit of a different spin on it. The Department of Justice did not bring the cases against Donald Trump. A special counsel who has a fair amount of independence from Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice made the prosecutorial decision to indict Donald Trump and prosecute him for his crimes against the American people. So, I agree with you that it does suggest that the cases must be strong or Jack Smith would not have brought them. But Jack Smith is a true, without fear or favor prosecutor. Think about it. He's a guy who went from the Department of Justice. He decided not to go into private practice to line his own pockets. Instead, he went to The Hague to prosecute war criminals. What does that tell you about him?
Yeah. Well, if he's looking for assholes to prosecute, he's got a pretty big one here. So we'll leave it there. With that said, obviously we'll stay on top of Peter Navarro as he continues to work his way through the justice system, and as well as the rest of these prosecutions that Trump and his cabinet, his circle, are contending with right now. So for those watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.